What is indigenous education? This film's goal is to participate in decolonizing education and critically analyze the way indigenous education is currently being taught in Ontario. When thinking back to elementary school, what can you remember about the things that were taught involving indigenous people? Some topics such as fur trade, the settlers, the treaties, and involvement in war probably sound familiar. Other than what many learned in history class, can you think of a time when Indigenous teachings or their way of life were taught accurately and in detail? Here are some examples of a textbook based on the Canadian curriculum, which parts of the book make it seem like the displacement of Indigenous people was all a part of an agreement with settlers. We can see the way in which Canada has a lack of education of Indigenous practices. This is something that is slowly being acknowledged by school boards, but still needs much work. In college and university today, we have a lot more Indigenous education available. Colleges and universities are teaching Indigenous real histories, current issues, languages, Indigenous art, and traditional teachings. Currently in Ontario, to learn the real histories of Indigenous people at an education institution, you usually need to be enrolled in college or university, some form of post-secondary, or be in an Indigenous program. However, these are still not mandatory classes in Canada and leaves most of the population excluded from true Indigenous education and real history. Have you ever taken one of these classes for the purpose of decolonizing education and learning the Indigenous ways? Or was it just an elective you chose off a list?
Something that should be included in history classes today would be expanding the knowledge on traditional teachings. These can be about sacred practices and lessons, or even stories that have something for us to take away and digest. These things help us in mind, body, and soul connections, not only to ourselves but to others as well. For example, including the sharing circle would be a great way to teach the young ones how to support one another when it matters most.
To decolonize education in Canada, we must create space for Indigenous students to meet with elders and smudge, use medicines. We must have legal recognition of the traditional lands and traditional resources. We must encourage institutions to hire Indigenous people, providing opportunity for Aboriginal workers to succeed and become valuable members of the workforce. We must make Indigenous languages, histories, and traditional teachings mandatory at all levels of education. We must offer Indigenous perspectives. Encourage teaching about Indigenous people and the cultures in school. And the appropriation of the culture should come to an end.